Forget the debt mess over there in Europe. All eyes now on the massive one here. The hole we're in, nearly $15 trillion. And there's only 11 days left for that committee on Capitol Hill to get a deal done. But did something that just happened in the Buckeye state just buck any chances of that happening? Voters in Ohio saying yes to unions, no to desperately needed spending cuts. And someone here says, don't think lawmakers in Washington didn't notice. Hi, everyone. I'm Brenda Buttner. This is Bulls and Bears. Let's get right to it. The Bulls and Bears this week: Gary B. Smith, Tobin Smith, Jonas Max Ferris, along with Todd Schoenberger from the Black Bay Group, and Susan Ox, a former senior advisor at the Treasury Department. Welcome to everybody. Gary B., you say as goes Ohio, so go the cuts.
Absolutely, Brenda. You know, if you are on that super committee and you're on the fiscal austerity side, you are quaking in your boots right now. You know, Ohio backed this union proposal, but what they really backed was bloated pensions, outrageous salaries, outrageous hiring practices, non-existent firing practices, all the things that we need, the opposite side of which, to turn this country around and show some fiscal soundness. Instead, Ohio went the other way, and I'll tell you what, if, again, you're on that super committee, you just lost a lot of trump cards in your hand.
Susan, what does this mean for the super committee, do you think?
I think the message from the Ohio vote is that there's solidarity among struggling middle-class workers. You know, you look at what they were voting for. You have a lot of middle-class workers who are the government workers in Ohio, and they're suffering right now. And there's a lot of people who really were in sympathy with them and saying, we don't want to see their rights stripped away. This was about collective bargaining and not wanting to see them really, you know, having to bear the brunt of the cost cuts right now.
Toby?
Well, we have some hard decisions to make, and I can appreciate that if you were the beneficiary of having these type of benefits, that you wouldn't want to see them go away. But that's not going to get us out of the hole here. And that type of thinking, you know, I'm not a politician. I'm just an economics guy. From an economic standpoint, these cuts not only need to be made, they needed to step up and go to the big cuts. Now, you know, they're going to wuss out. I mean, that's a very technical term, but clearly they're going to look this in the eye and say, well, gosh, we probably maybe a trillion over 10 years. Oh, did I say a trillion? I really meant 500 million. Well, it's really only 300 billion. That's what's going to happen.
Come on. I mean, Todd, did you not expect them to wuss out?
Look, Ohio is a big swing state right now, so when you start looking at this super committee, the Democrats know that they need to appeal to a certain base that's out there that want these entitlements, and we heard this from the vote on Tuesday. You know, when we're going forward, though, they need to think big. They can't use the Ohio vote as the way that's going to swing them. The problem is that the Democrats are never going to compromise with the Republicans right now on this, and the Republicans desperately, they're talking about possible tax revenues right now, but yet again, they know that they want the cuts, and the Dems are never going to do the cutting.
Jonas, what do you think this means?
I think it's a small microcosm of the same problem, which is if they had another vote in Ohio next week, say, okay, well, let's have across-the-board tax increase in the state to pay for the higher benefits we're going to get from having these union powers, that would fail also. And that's the basic problem here, is that everybody seems to want a benefit structure of like Sweden, but they don't want to pay for it with the resulting high tax rates that those European countries have to pay for those things. So that is a path to bankruptcy. You either have to vote these things down, these spending, you have to have these cuts, or you got to raise the taxes. And the committee's going to say it. They're going to have big tax increases, and they're going to have huge cuts, and no one's going to want to do both of them, like which has happened with all the committees in the super this and that.
The risk that we're going to run right now, Brenda, is that if the if the entire super committee does not come to terms on this and does not think big, then we're looking at another possible cut of our debt rating here at the U.S. If that's the case, it makes debt that much more expensive. And now we're going down a path that now we hear so much about from the European countries right now. And that's the last thing we want.
Well, actually,
but this isn't. It's not a microcosm. It's a macrocosm because it's happening everywhere, Todd, by the way.
Well, Gary B., actually, then it would set in motion some really important cuts if they don't do it, right?
Well, yes and no, but here's the depressing part, Brenda. If everyone walks away, what they call a sequester, I believe, then the cuts amount to, over the next 10 years, the increases will still increase in the budget $1.6 trillion.
Right.
Without the sequester, it's $1.7 trillion. So you're talking a drop in the bucket. But I'll tell you what, Brenda, at this point, I would take that rather than a just flat-out increase in spending, increase in taxes, and all that other BS that we're going to see.
Susan?
You know, one of the other problems, though, is that the rating agencies have already said if it winds up that we can't reach a deal and we wind up in gridlock again, that they're going to consider another ratings downgrade, and that's just not something we can afford. So I think the committee has to go back to work and has to find ways to work together and get some meaningful cuts done. And, you know, there's a huge bipartisan group in the House and the Senate. You know, it's very evenly between Democrats and Republicans saying, go big, get to $4 trillion, not this $1.2 trillion. We want to see a real deal. And only this week, after months of negotiations, have the Republicans even put a hint of tax increases on the table. So we might be finally starting to see a break in the deadlock here, but it's been much too long in coming.
And Gary B., those automatic cuts that you were talking about don't even kick in until 2013.
Well,
Right.
yeah, and exactly. And, you know, to Susan's point, it sounds like a big number. But remember, this is spread over 10 years. And during that 10 years, it's not like the budget is flat. It's still growing. That's the problem.
Right.
Well, also,
baseline budgeting, Gary B. That's exactly what it is. You're looking at departments that will see their budgets increase 3 to 10% automatically, no matter what. It doesn't matter what the super committee does. If anything, why don't they squash that idea and go for some real cuts? That would obviously help us in the long term, but it's not going to happen.
Jonas, Ohio, how much really do you think that it meant?
I just think it represents the problem that nobody wants to face. The rating agencies are perfectly happy with a tax increase or a spending cut. They don't care which one we choose. We're choosing neither, and that is the problem. And they're not choosing that either in Ohio.
Well, then why don't we get the cut? Why don't we let it go and not have the vote and let the cuts come in, and let's see if life doesn't end. Because I am fairly sure that life is not going to end. And let's get the cut now, because that's the thing they're afraid of. They're afraid to get it. Once we start the cuts, then I think we can start to get some momentum. Right now, they're like someone who's never cooked pasta before. They're afraid to put the pasta in the water to see what happens.
You know what, though? Some of the cuts that are in the automatic triggers are really draconian. I mean, I don't want to see those kinds of cuts in defense spending the way that they're just slashing through. So it really needs to be a much more thoughtful way that we're approaching this
Susan,
budget deal.
How can they possibly be draconian when the baseline budget is increasing at this phenomenal rate with almost no slowdown? You won't even feel the cuts out there. You know that. When you go to these departments and say, okay, you got to cut 1% over the next 10 years. What is that? They get rid of the coffee mugs like Obama's new program? Come on.
You know what? You want to tell that to our men and women who are still fighting overseas, that you're going to just
you know what? We have the biggest, most powerful military compared to everyone else in the entire world. You don't think there's any waste and fraud in the military?
Okay.
Yeah, I would say, right. We haven't lost a dogfight. We haven't lost a dogfight in 50 years, okay? I think we're okay.
Okay, all right. That's